Welcome to the Good and Well Soul podcast. I'm Kim.
I'm Dishon. Thank you for joining us on this journey to physical, emotional, and spiritual wellness. All right, so today we are talking about a special topic. If you all are just binge listening to the Good and Well Soul podcast, I just want to recommend that you stop. This is your trigger warning. If you are not ready, we're going to be talking about grief today. So if you're not in a place or in an emotional space to hear this conversation, hit pause and come back to us when you got yourself together.
But come back to us now.
Right.
Don't hit pause and then it turn into a stop.
Go re-listen to another episode.
Yeah. Come back to us.
All right.
All right. Well, like Dishon said in the trigger warning, this is a difficult topic. I had to get myself ready to talk about this. I think this has been on the docket for a year. Actually longer than that. Because in 2019, I had this whole thing where me and my dad were supposed to do a podcast about this topic.
I had no idea.
Yes. So I had talked him into, I'm always trying to collab, get him to do stuff with me. So we were going to do a podcast about grief and just kind of some of the things that we learned about our own grief and just the experiences that we'd had. And he's had some experiences, some of which I'll share today, but just wanting to get the word out to let people know that grief is hard. And even though it's something that we tend to avoid, I don't think it should be something that we avoid.
Yeah. Grief is uncomfortable, and I think it's one of those things that it's uncomfortable for us. It's uncomfortable for those that are around us.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes when we're grieving, when people are grieving, those that are around us don't necessarily know what to do, what to say. And so sometimes people don't say anything, don't do anything just because we don't know how to engage with somebody who's feeling something so heavy and weighty.
Yeah. And I think especially when you think about like scripture that says, weep with those that weep, rejoice with those that rejoice, mourn with those that mourn. You think about those things. And it's like, okay, but what does that look like? What does that mean? Do I just go to the funeral? I show up at the wake, I bring some chicken. Like, I don't know what that looks like. So hopefully during this episode, as we're sharing just our own personal experiences, those of you that are listening that are either experiencing grief or have close people to you that have experienced grief or in a season of mourning right now, you can kind of get some tips, something that can help you, those practical things to do or things to avoid, so that you can be there for those people because you love them, right? Like, so I think when you were saying people don't know what to say, and so sometimes they avoid saying anything, it can give the appearance of like the absence of caring or the absence of love, but that's not always the case.
Yeah. So, and hopefully it's not just for the loved ones, but for the people that are dealing with the grief as well. I'm not sure if you said that. I know you were saying for the loved ones.
What do you mean?
You were saying giving tips for those that love somebody that's dealing with grief.
Absolutely. Yeah. Tips so also that hopefully as you're listening, you can get tips for those of you who are in a season of grief. Yes. That you can learn how to manage your grief, how to live your life in spite of your grief, because it's not going anywhere. As much as people say time heals all wounds, I disagree. Those wounds are going to be there. They're scars in our lives that, if you stab me with a knife, my scar from that may never go away. As much cocoa butter as we want to slather on it, as much vitamin E as you want to put on it, like you're still going to have that wound. You're still going to have that scar. And I think that's what grief has taught me is that, I'm still going to have these scars. They're with me for life. So time is not going to take away that pain, that hurt.
Yeah. I read some one time about scars. It said it takes about 7 years to shed a full layer of skin.
Oh, wow.
But I have a scar right here that's at least 20 years old.
Wow. How'd you get that?
I stabbed myself.
Mercy. I was thinking about the scar on my leg. from when that cabinet fell on me.
Oh, mercy.
My daddy saved my life.
Wow.
And that scar is still there. That scar is from like, I probably was like 8. Well, that's some decades ago. So, especially too, I think it's important for us to talk about this now. And we're putting this out now because we're entering into the holiday season. And a lot of us are excited about the holidays. We got Thanksgiving coming up. We got Christmas, New Year's Day, you know, all of these different seasons or these holidays where we're so joyful. But there are people that are literally hurting during these same seasons. And I think it's okay to recognize that, because part of what makes, you know, when I think about Christmas and the anticipation of the coming of Christ, the part of what makes that so joyful and exciting is because we were in a state of, how can I say this? We wouldn't have the excitement and the joy of expecting something if we didn't need a savior. You know, if we didn't need Jesus to come into our world to make things right again, right? There would be no point in being excited for this thing to come. So we get so excited thinking about, oh yeah, we're going to celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ, and that's great. But like, why are we celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ? Because this world sucks. Because we're in sin. Because we need a savior. Because there is death. Because there is dying. Because there is pain. Because there is suffering. So we needed to be reconciled with Christ, our savior, with God. So I'm not trying to like go into like a whole tangent. But I think the anticipation and the hope that the holidays bring point us to where we are.
Yeah. And I mean, just to take that analogy a little bit further, it's amazing how the hope that we get from Christ resulted from the grief of the Father. He had to lose his son in order for us to have the hope and the life and the joy. So
come on, preacher.
That's something. The grief, sometimes we don't take into account what our grief is able to produce.
Oh, that's good.
So
I had to write that down. What our grief is able to produce. Yeah. That's going to be a whole chapter in my book. That resonated with me. I like that. What the grief is able to produce. Come on.
Hey, hot off the presses.
I like that. This is recorded, so I don't have to write it down.
There you go.
But I'm using that.
All right. You got it.
All right. Thank you.
One.
So let's talk about grief. So there are different types of grief. And first of all, let's just say this. This will be a 2-part episode. This is a heavy topic. It's kind of weighty. And personally, I don't feel like it's something that we can adequately package together in a nice, neat 45-minute, even though we go over 45 minutes, but a nice little segment. So this might be a 2-part episode. But there are different types of grief, different losses that you can grieve.
Yeah.
So you can grieve any loss, right? We can grieve the loss of a pet, the loss of a job, a marriage, the loss of an opportunity, the loss of a loved one. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. In my field of work, I work with people who have developmental disabilities and they're aging. And one thing that we're always thinking about is the loss of ability. As we get older, we lose the independence. We lose control of our bodies. We lose our ability to get up and go and do as we please. And I think especially in the midst of this pandemic, some of us have not experienced any health decline, but we lost that independence and some of the things that we relied on, you know, whether it was paychecks or just being able to go to the grocery store or go to the movie theater or go to the restaurant and not have to have a mask over your face and be concerned about, am I going to catch this potentially deadly disease? So
that's a good point.
All types of grief. The world is grieving together right now.
Absolutely. And then also, I think about this, the loss of a celebrity. You know, a lot of times people take that and they just think, you didn't know them personally. but that person may have had an impact in your life. And that is a real grief. That is a real loss. For the purposes of this episode and the next episode, I'm going to be focusing on the loss of a loved one. That's the most prevalent and pressing area of grief, which I am experiencing right now.
Yeah. And I'm just going to be piggybacking with you on that. I mean, I feel like there's other grief that I've experienced, but I feel like it can take the back seat.
Well, I think, whatever you feel to share, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So since you were saying there's other grief that you've experienced, it could take the back seat, but I know you've experienced personal loss with loved ones as well. Do you want to share a little bit about your personal experiences with grief?
I was thinking about that as I was driving back from dropping off Joey. And one thing that I think about in my experience of grief, the two losses that really come to mind the most are my granddad and my Uncle Bruce. And I think my granddad because he was my mom's dad, and my Uncle Bruce because he was my cousin's dad that I was closest to. And so I lost my granddad this summer between 7th and 8th grade. I remember because I went to a Christian summer camp that year, and that was the year that he was really sick and he passed. And for our family, those two losses in particular, we lived in the hospital. Like we were just there. And I remember it being a season of seeing granddad go through all of this stuff physically, but it was also this season where as cousins, we just kicked it. Like we would take over a waiting room in a hospital. All the family members would be there, and me and Terrence and Fallon and all these, we'd just be kicking it at the hospital. And if not at the hospital, at grandma's house, you know? And so I remember in those seasons, there would be, when we finally did lose that person, there would be much weeping. But then with our family, everything, my wife always tells about how everything in Chicago is so robust. There will be robust weeping and crying, but there will be robust laughing and silliness and robust amounts of food. That's just something we just do as black folk. So those are the things that I recall distinctly. And I think those seasons, I specifically remember at one of the funerals. I don't remember if it was my granddad's when I was on my way to 8th grade or my Uncle Bruce, which that happened after my freshman year in college. But I remember a season during the funeral service where it was like the service got high, because at funeral services we would weep and shout and dance and give glory to God.
All the emotions. Yeah.
But I remember the service died down. I feel like I remember being the only one standing up just wailing and crying, and I just couldn't control myself. And I remember a moment where my dad was just like, sit down, stop. And I think about that because I remember almost just feeling free to just be like, this is what I feel, and I don't know how to stop it, so whatever. And I'm sure I sat down, and I'm sure I ended up getting it together at some point, but I think there is a sense of, with grief at some point where somebody wants to say, okay, that's enough for you. So that was the one thing that personally, in my life prior to marrying you and experiencing grief with you, that's, I think, the things that stood out the most to me about my personal experience of grief.
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot. So for me, I've lost all three of my grandfathers. So 3 because my maternal grandfather, my paternal grandfather, and then the one that I was close to, which is my grandpapa, my grandmother's husband. So that would be my dad's stepfather. But he, for all intents and purposes, was my granddaddy. The one that, we would go over to the house and he had something for the birds. That's what he called us. We had snacks and treats, and he just loved us, and we felt that love from him. So I lost grandpapa. I can't remember. I want to say in between my freshman and sophomore year. I remember I did not have glasses, and I got glasses. And I remember my mom was like, we have to get you glasses because I want you to be able to see at grandpapa's funeral. Like, so I remember that. I lost my two biological, I guess, grandparents, grandfathers in my adulthood. I didn't really have a close relationship with them at all. So I think my grief from that was more of seeing my father grieve the loss of his father, or individuals grieve, cousins grieve the loss of a grandfather more than my personal grief. Coming into high school, or excuse me, not high school, college, I lost a very dear friend. She was a little girl when she passed away. And I feel like that has always, dang. I said I wasn't gonna cry. I thought I was gonna cry about Brian and Daddy. Well, that started quickly. Oh, goodness.
It's okay.
I lost a friend who, she was a little girl. And we were like 4 years apart, 5 years apart. Like, I think like four, almost 5 years apart. But anyway, we went to church together, and she was like my little mentee. You know, I didn't know nothing about having a for real mentee, but I was really active in children's ministry and leadership, and I loved her dearly. She passed unexpectedly right before I went to college. And then the next year, my auntie passed, who I was close with, my mom's aunt, my mom's sister, who, you know, she was my auntie. You know, it wasn't really, she just was a character. So, you know, I lost her. And then my uncle passed away while I was in college. I think that was my freshman year too. And I always say he was my favorite uncle because I really don't feel like I had a lot of uncles. Like if I think back, I'm like, I probably had like 3, but he was my favorite, Uncle Tony. So he passed. I mean, it was just like a lot of boom, boom, people passing. All of them weren't necessarily the closest to me, but it was just like thing after thing. So that was my experience with grief as a child / young adult, 18, 19, 20. And then I feel like there was a season where people that were close to me were not dying. I wasn't experiencing any close family members passing away. My best friend's dad passed away while we were in college. You know, that was another person that was like, you know, a dad to me, a dad figure to me that passed away. So it was just like all of these things happening. And then there was like this gap of like many years where our family, the Like family, we weren't touched by that tragedy. And then in 2019, my youngest brother died. He was 30 years old. He died during active duty in the military. It was unexpected and it shattered me. Broke my heart. And so I remember thinking, I used to always think, God, what's the worst thing that's going to happen to me in my life? And up until then, my dad had prostate cancer and been healed from that. He suffered heart attacks. Like, there were serious things that had happened. You know, my dad had went through some medical concerns and some things that were scary. And I thought like, Lord, maybe that's going to be I don't know why. I don't even know if people think this kind of stuff. Like, what's the worst thing that's going to happen to me, God? But I used to always think like, maybe that's going to be the worst thing that happens in my life. My dad going through cancer, or my dad having this, or my dad having that. And then Brian died, my brother. He was only 30. And I remember feeling like, God, this is the worst thing that you could ever let me go through. This is the absolute worst thing. This is the worst, God. Just that loss of a sibling, of someone that's so close to you. And, everybody's relationships with their siblings are different. And I feel like that's one thing I've learned about grief is that even if like someone else loses a brother or a sister like you have, the way their relationship is with that person, they may not still be able to relate to you with their loss because that relationship was just different. Yeah. And so my brother and I were very close. I had a video put together for Brian's service highlighting all of the best of times because he kicked it. He lived them 30 years. Oh, yeah, he did. And my other brother, Ray, was like, that's what he would have wanted. Hit the church packed and all of his wrestling moves. He doing flips and whatnot. Everybody watching. So I agree. I think he would have. But I remember my mom said after the video was done, I thought it was funny. You all, I don't know what people are going to say about this. But she said, well, Kim, when you go, we could just use the same video and take out the wrestling stuff.
Wow.
Because, so much of our life experiences were shared. Mm-hmm. Like when I literally look back on a certain season of our lives, like as young adults, like all the pictures when I met this person or when I did that, like we were together. Mm-hmm. And so that rocked me, losing him. And I know some people don't like to say losing, but it's just easy to say that sometimes, I know he ain't lost. Yeah. Absent in the body. He present with the Lord. I know where he at. But y'all know what I mean. Okay, so that was 2019 in July. And then we go into 2020. And of course, COVID is like rearing its ugly head. Mm-hmm. And then in November of 2020, my dad dies unexpectedly, very suddenly. Mm-hmm. And there was, again, here I was thinking, okay, God, I've experienced the worst. And then I lose my daddy. And I'm a daddy's girl. So having those two back to back, one year and then the next year, it was just devastating. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really taken its toll on me as an individual, as a person. It just has. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
that was a lot.
One thing that I think about just with having lost Brian, having lost Pops, with a lot of people that we lost in my family, there was the progression, or I should say the decline of health, the gradual decline. And so I think over that decline, you're able to, we're never ready, but you're able to start wrapping your mind around this may be this person's last moments.
Yeah. And
I think the thing that was so traumatic about having lost Brian and having lost Pops is we didn't see it coming.
Yes.
With either of them, Brian just never saw it coming because, he just was the picture of health in my mind. Mm-hmm. And with Pops, it was like we knew he had his health issues, but we just didn't know it was that bad. Mm-mm. And so I think those are the things where there's those moments of, if I would have had a chance, I would have said this to you. I would have done this with you. I would have taken you here or
yes.
bought you this. Because you didn't get a chance to really, make amends, as they say.
Mm-hmm. Or just have that closure, maybe.
Closure, yeah. That's
because, it's not like we were in a bad place with them.
Yeah.
We were in a great place with them. And it's funny because I feel like even in that, I see the grace of God. Mm-hmm. So the weekend my brother died, I called him and I left him a message. And I was just like, hey, I just calling to check on you and say hi, I love you. And I'm like grateful that was the last message I left. Like it was literally, I'm calling just because I love you. Mm-hmm. That's it. Like I thank God that was my last call to him. Like whether he heard the message or not, that was what was on my mind.
Yeah.
You know? And then I think about with my dad, a couple of days before he died, I was leaving his house and he was coming to his house. And so we were on the street, like kind of parked like the police do when they're facing opposite directions, but they're talking. And I remember like, I could have just driven by and like, okay, see you, Dad, see you later. And I stopped and he stopped and he rolled down his window and I rolled down my window and we just talked. And it wasn't like this profound conversation, but it was an intentional moment where we stopped and we talked. And I remember there was a pause in the conversation and it was kind of like, I didn't necessarily want to stop talking. And he kind of was like, well, we're still talking, but it was a pause. And I was like, all right, Daddy, we're going in. Cause I knew he wasn't feeling well. I was like, go on in, get you some rest and I'll talk to you later. And I just thank God for that because I'm glad that my last memory isn't me just driving by waving, which if that was my last memory, it was just going to have to be. And I waved with love, but we stopped and we talked.
Yeah.
And I thank God for that. Like, to me, I feel like that's God. That's just his grace that he allowed those to be two of my last interactions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the other thing I think about too, just with having lost Brian and Pops back to back, I feel like there's that sense when grief happens with a single person, it knocks the wind out of you. And over time, you start to get to the point where even though it still hurts, you're able to say, okay, I can breathe again. And I think with Brian passed in 2019, we got the wind knocked out of us. And as soon as it's like we're trying to get back on our feet, it's like the wind gets knocked out of us again.
Yeah.
So it's just grief upon grief, just that compounding nature of it.
Absolutely. Because Dad died August, September, October, November. Yeah, like 15 months after Brian. And I remember my line sister had called me and we were talking. And it was close to around right before Daddy had passed. And she was asking me how I was doing. And I remember her saying, like, you're starting to sound like you're doing okay. And I told her, I said, honestly, for the first time in over a year, I feel like I want to live. If it wasn't for Joseph, I did not care. If it wasn't for the fact that I was raised in, I guess he was 3 then, I was like, it's whatever. I don't care. My brother is gone. And I had finally gotten to that point of, okay, let me live and not just live for Joseph, because you're going to be okay. You're an adult. You're going to be fine if I go. You're going to be okay. You're going to learn to live again, to love again, to you can put on your clothes. You know what I'm saying? You can cook your own dinner. But having somebody that was dependent on me, that is what made me get up every morning. I remember I used to go for walks. Daddy had told me about Spanish Lake. And I would go for walks around the lake. And there is a part at the lake where there's I guess it's like a dock.
It's the boat ramp.
Yeah, okay, the boat ramp. Every time I would get to that part, I would think because it's slanted, right? So it goes into the water, it eases in. And I would think, just like those boats just ease into the water, I can just ease into this water. And I could just let this water wash over me because I felt so heavy. And I felt like I can just let this water wash over me and I can give in to the weight of this water because my grief was so strong. And I would walk and I would look at that water and I would just think, I can just let it do what it's going to do. And then I would just say, okay, but if you do that, you're going to die, right? It's not like I'm just going to walk in and then be like, I'm weightless. And then life is going to go on. You know what that means. And then I would just gather up my courage and my strength and I would continue to walk. So it is something when you get past that point, when I could walk around the lake without feeling like that. That's what I went to. I walked at that lake all the time. And the days when I could walk around that lake without feeling like that at that certain point, it was just like, thank you, God. Like I'm finally at the point where I'm just enjoying nature and I don't feel like I have to succumb to this grief in this way. And then as soon as that happens, my dad dies. So that was hard.
Yeah. Wow.
So we told y'all this was going to be a heavy episode.
Yeah, I don't think I knew that. I mean, I knew that you felt it deeply. I don't think that was my first time hearing that.
Yeah. Yep. I think growing up in a pastor's household, I'm very familiar with grief because my dad would minister to people in their grief. And people always wanted my daddy to preach their funerals. Because daddy knew daddy could preach a funeral, man. Especially if he knew the person. He was going to make you laugh. He's going to tell some stories. He was always going to hit you with the gospel, leave you with hope after you know what I'm saying? Afterwards, like you were going to have some hope and know that, this death doesn't have to be the end.
Yeah.
And I remember back then, he used to teach about the 5 stages of grief. Have you ever, I know you have heard about the 5 stages of grief. What did you learn about the 5 stages of grief? Just maybe in your classes, as your counseling classes, or just as a clergy member, is there anything that you learned about the stages of grief?
I remember learning about it at some point. I don't know when or where, from whom. I don't feel like I had a paradigm for it when I learned about it. I mean, I think I really became more familiar with even sitting with people in their grief after becoming a part of this family. Just being there with dad at funerals.
Yeah. And you did funerals with him of people you had never met before.
Yeah, yeah. But at the same time, I feel like even then, it's one thing to do a funeral service, but it's another thing to do somebody just found out they lost a loved one and giving them that phone call and being there for them and checking in on them, that type of thing. I didn't have a paradigm for that because I wasn't doing that stuff with him. And now trying to learn those things, it's like, yeah, because growing up, I didn't see all that. I felt like there were certain aspects of grief that I was shielded from. So I feel like you had more of a paradigm for that than I did.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, there definitely were days when my dad would get that phone call. So-and-so just died. So-and-so is about to take their last breath. Like, I would see my daddy get up, get dressed, be at the hospital. He would do visits. My mom would do visits to the hospital, people that were sick, that were dying. I remember them teaching us about, when you go to the hospital, you don't stay all long. You don't be in there talking all loud and being all raucous. Is that a word?
Yeah.
Being all raucous and, uncouth. You go in there with a certain demeanor. You follow the lead of the family. I remember my dad talking to me about, and sometimes I'm wondering, like, why was he telling me all this stuff? Or how did I learn this? Some of it by observation even. Him sharing, like, in those days after a loss, like, as the clergy, like, I'm here to console. I'm here to listen. I'm here to pray for them. Whatever the family wants is right. The family dictates what happens. I don't push anything. You don't push your agenda on a grieving family. I learned all those things by observation, by him sharing anecdotes, by me seeing my parents minister to people who were grieving. And then even I remember him specifically teaching on the 5 stages of grief. And the 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. So I grew up hearing about these 5 stages, but it wasn't until I actually experienced grief and I started reading things to help me understand my grief that I learned that Kubler-Ross, who came up with these stages, she actually developed this model as she was interviewing individuals who were dying. So they had life-threatening illnesses and she was interviewing them, and the stages were their stages as they were experiencing end of life. It was never you lose your loved one and then you go through these stages. That wasn't the original intention of her work. She wasn't creating this work off of how did the loved ones handle the grief. She was creating it off of these anecdotes, these anecdotes and this time, these interviews with these individuals who were experiencing life-threatening illnesses. And I think that's great to point out because a lot of times when people experience grief, especially in our Western culture, you want to just go through it like bam, 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 bam. Bam, 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 bam. Yeah, that's 5. You want to go through it like in these five linear, like a progression. And that is not what happens.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know I haven't read as many grief books as you, but I was just picturing grief being on a seashore, and I remember back in the day trying to build sandcastles and not realizing that the tide changed as the day passed, and so that initial grief will hit, and that wave can wash away all that you've built, and you'll think, okay, that wave of grief came, it's gone, the tide has changed, it's another day, I can rebuild again. And depending on what your foundation is, whenever the next wave of grief comes back in, it's like, oh snap, am I gonna lose it all again?
Yeah.
Or have I learned how to navigate when these feelings hit me, how to process it, how to deal with it, and not to lose everything. Yeah, you're probably gonna have to regroup and regain, but not losing everything whenever the waves of grief hit.
Yeah. I like that analogy. I like that analogy a lot. A book that I have found very helpful was I Wasn't Ready to Say Goodbye. And I want to read an excerpt from it. And it's talking about the 5 stages of grief and how it's kind of a myth. And it says, written for use by someone who is living while dying, many grievers are perplexed when they do not fit into the mold. These stages only partially apply to a survivor of sudden death. In addition to these stages, the survivor of sudden death will experience many more stages and rages that need to be worked through. And then later on it says, in reality, grieving is more like a maze of emotions than an elevator that starts at the bottom and arrives at the penthouse of peace and understanding. Like a maze, we go forward a bit and then back over the same territory. If we learn to love and accept ourselves, even as we are emotionally weaving through the maze, we may begin to see our humanness and our brokenness as a threshold to personal growth. In any case, it is important to assure yourself, no matter how crazy and lost in the maze you may feel, that you do come out on the other side and that you are not alone.
Yeah.
So I love that because, again, it emphasizes that, you might think, okay, well, I'm past denial. Like, I don't even know. I'm wondering if I ever was in like a denial. I don't know that I ever was in like I don't know.
I definitely feel like with Brian, that first couple hours, first day, it was just like,
Oh, yeah. Like, yeah. Oh, 100%. You're right. Like, I feel like I was the only person in the hospital that did not know that this man was dying. When I literally look back at my messages, because I wrote everything down on my phone, everything the doctor said, I wrote it verbatim. When I read it now, I'm like, how in the world did you think he was going to make it out? I thought he was going to be fine and get like a kidney transplant.
so that.
And it's crazy because now I look back and I'm like, I think about the things I said. I think about how my dad looked. And I think about how other people looked. And I'm like, I think about like his wife and some of the things that she was saying. And I remember thinking, oh, that's a nice thing to say, but like, he'll be fine. Like, you'll get to tell him this in person. I never realized this man was going in those like 2 days that we were at the hospital. I had no clue. So that was definitely denial.
Yeah. And
Definitely.
And then I think when we left, it's like we went to Walmart.
We
We
went to
got stuff so we
Walmart.
could stay the night because we were too tired to drive home
Yeah.
that night. And it just felt like this. Now what?
Yeah.
Like what are we supposed to do now? For me, it was like, we're going to the hospital. He's going to come out. We're all going to leave together.
Yeah.
And we didn't. And
And I remember being at Walmart walking around thinking, these people don't know my brother just died. Like it had been out like hours. And I'm like walking around Walmart, like getting underwear, getting a toothbrush. And I'm thinking, no one knows. Like I was in like a fog. And then we went to McDonald's and got like burgers.
oh, I forgot about that.
We did. Like we got burgers. And I remember I still got the text of my dad's order. He was like, give me a Big Mac. You know? Yeah, so I definitely feel like that was denial. But when I look at these different stages, like bargaining and different things, like I'm like, I don't necessarily see myself, definitely not linear progression going through these. But there are definite times where I have that depression, that anger. Oh my gosh. Like, yeah. You know, so it's not like I'm going through this and it's like, I made it out on the other side. I'm okay now. I've conquered the 5 stages of grief. No,
Yeah.
you know. So how has grief affected you personally?
I think for me, one of the biggest things that I took away from having lost Brian is to live with no regret and to not wait on the right circumstances and situations to do the things in life that I want to do, that I feel like I should be doing, that I'm called to do, but to just go out and be like, okay, God, this is what I want to do. If it's your will, let it happen. And if not, then maybe next time. But sometimes I think I'll just be like, well, we don't have this. And, maybe this isn't a good season. But just really trying to go after stuff now instead of just sitting back and letting life pass me by. So I think that maybe mentally, that was probably the biggest thing. And then I think just,
Brian would love that.
yeah, yeah. And I think on an ongoing basis, just with Brian and Pops, that feeling of, man, I want to share this memory with them. I want to share this experience with them. I want to talk with them about this thing, or see what they would think about that, or I wish I had their help with this, so
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the ongoing thing, just feeling that longing to still have them as a part of life as it continues on.
Yeah. That emotional support. Because they definitely were in your corner. Yeah.
Yeah. How about you?
Well, for me, I early on realized that everybody grieves differently. And I had to learn this the hard way, that everyone grieves differently. Because the way someone else may have outwardly manifested their grief caused me harm. It hurt me to see their grief manifested in that way. And so I had to learn to create boundaries. I learned from the books and the podcast and the sermons on grief that I could manage my grief. And I had to manage my grief. And it reminds me of, it was a couple days, 2 3 days, I'm not sure, after Brian had died. And maybe it was longer than that, I'm not sure. But it was very close, short time frame. And I had been going to his wife's house. I had been going to my mom's house. Like I had been every day I was going to someone else's house to be there, to be the big sister, to do all the responsible things, to help, to be there for them in their grief. And I remember my line sister texted me, was like, where are you? And I was like, well, I'm going to go here at my mom's house. And she was like, well, who's coming to your house? You know how she, who going to be at your house for you?
I remember that.
And I was like, well, no one's really asked to come to my house. People are just doing for the wife and for the parents. She was like, no, you going to be at home and I'm coming to your house. And I remember her showing up. And the first thing she said was, I ain't going to say it. Don't worry. She was like, bleep. This sucks. You know, she was like, this is bleep, 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 bleep. And I was sitting there like, it is. Say it again, because I don't cuss. Say it one more time, because this is that. But I remember just her, like, that was the first person for me that I felt like was like, no, you're grieving. Stop trying to be the Kim that shows up for everybody and sit your butt down and cry for yourself.
Yeah.
So I had to learn that. And then even later on, like Mel, she would text me, and I always felt like whenever she texted me, it was, I'm texting you with the understanding that you're grieving. Like, I'm asking how you're doing. And she had to be like, Kim, like, it's okay to not do this. It's okay to not, quote unquote, be there for these situations or this person in this way, because it's like, it's making it worse for you. So that was a big lesson that I learned. And I'm honestly still learning how to do. I'm getting a lot better. Grief counseling has helped with that.
Yeah.
So there's that. I also feel like just exhaustion, pure exhaustion. Just no energy, none. Just, I need to sleep all the time, turn everything off. I'm so tired. I think there was that exhaustion, being distracted. My mind, like, I'm pretty sharp, I would say. I'm pretty quick. I can come up with a retort or a response. If you give me a scenario, I can think through it quickly and rapidly come up with pros and cons, different scenarios, what's going to happen if, a flow chart, if you will, of decision making and how it's going to impact everything. I was just foggy in the brain. I went back to work the week we buried my brother. I was back at work getting ready for the school year. And I remember that school year, like, I always look at that art teacher and I'm like, she was so gracious with me. I could never pick my kids up on time. And I promise you, I tried. I would look at the schedule. I would say, okay, I have to get them at this time. I would have a timer. I was always either late or I was early. And it's because I spent my playing periods crying. I spent my playing periods literally just bawling my eyes out. And then I would get myself together, but I would be so distracted. And she would never make me feel bad. She would, oh, it's okay. And I'm like, it ain't okay, girl. You need your time to yourself. But just little things like that, I was just super distracted. I couldn't remember details, things that, like, even now sometimes we talk and you be like, well, I told you. And I'm like, I don't remember that. That's not like me.
Yeah. I think going back to your line sister and that visit, I feel like I resonated so much with her choice of language, just because it was just like, this fits the moment.
Oh, it fit.
And I feel like, and I'm not saying go out and just start cussing just because you felt, but
just go out and start cussing.
Wow.
Just cuss. Just let it rip. Because these situations be cuss worthy.
Oh, my Lord. And I thought there was going to be no shenanigans on this episode.
Oh, I'm always going to have a shenanigan.
But I think the thing that really came to mind is that that's a gift to be able to
cuss,
empathize.
Oh, okay.
In that way. I feel like going back to that verse that you mentioned, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. It's easy for us to open ourselves up to the positive emotions and the breadth and depth of those positive emotions. But I think for so many of us, we rush through the negative emotions because it's like, I don't want to be here.
Yeah.
I don't want to feel this.
Yeah.
I don't want to know what this is like. And we don't learn anything from it. Like that quote that you were saying earlier, we don't get the richness from it. And knowing her story, I know that she's experienced things, and
Yep.
I'm assuming that she sat in it for a while so that
Yep.
she was able to say, this is probably how she feels. And she expressed it in a way that resonated with you.
Yeah.
Versus just being a person just like, I'm sorry for your loss.
Yeah.
And I feel like not all of us know how, like I sit back and I wrestle with, do I know how to do that? Do I know how to recognize the emotion and say, man, this is just messed up. Like, this ain't right.
Yeah. And sitting in it. That's the thing. Like sitting in it. Don't rush it. You know, just sit in it. And if you're that person that's being there for someone, sometimes all we need is you to just sit in it with us. You know, I think physically, I definitely was gaining weight. I was gaining all the weight because I was not cooking.
We did do a lot of eating out back then.
I felt sorry for you because you was used to my good cooking. I wasn't cooking nothing. I didn't care. We was going to McDonald's. And I remember you were like, you ain't going to McDonald's. We was sneaking and going to McDonald's. JoJo was giving it up. Can we go get the Happy Kids meal? Shush, boy. You ain't supposed to know about that. We were going to McDonald's. You was eating them pizzas. We were eating out so much. I did not cook. I did not cook. And so I was gaining weight. Like, just, it was very unhealthy. I would get in the DoorDash or the whatever, like ordering food for lunch all the time. Like I was giving Starbucks so much money. The one that was on the corner of my job, man, I was going up in there getting all the sandwiches. And I would get sandwiches, chips, brownie, and a drink. Oh, I was getting all the things. I was like, and then I'm going to want a muffin. And that was just for lunch. Like I had already been up there for breakfast and gotten a grande white chocolate mocha and a banana bread and a croissant and some egg bites. Hello, I was eating all the food. And I ain't care.
And this episode is not sponsored by Starbucks.
It's not, but holla at your girl. Because some egg bites is good. But yeah, like physically, I feel like I was just gaining weight. I didn't have the emotional or the mental strength to even want to go walking or go work out. That didn't come until months later, much later, where I was like, okay, I gotta reverse this. You know, where I really looked at myself one day and was like, I can't fit nothing. This ain't gonna work. So there's that. Crying. That was all the time. I remember I would go to work. I would literally cry on my way to work, and I felt so bad for my son because he's 3 and I'm driving us to work and I'm boo-hooing. And he's just sitting in the back seat like, and I was like, Lord, just let him forget this. Just don't let him remember. But I would just be so sad on my way to work every day. And I would drop him off. And I don't even know if his teachers knew, because that was when he was across the street from me. And I would go, or was it? No, it wasn't. It wasn't. That was another season of grief. But when he was downstairs in the same building, and I would go just have lunch with him sometimes. Like I would make it a point once a week to have lunch with him. And his teachers were so sweet. They knew. But it was just like, I just need to not be in my room crying, you know? And then I would keep it together at work, cry on my breaks, come home. I would be okay on the way home, do our food, do all the stuff. And then like at 11 o'clock at night, I would just go on my phone and I would look at all my pictures and I would cry for like 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah, I remember that.
And then I would wake up tired because I've spent the night crying. Do it all over again the next day. And that was that entire school year. That was my system.
Yep. I didn't know what to do for you in that moment either.
I know. But I appreciate you being there. You were there. But it was a lot. It was a lot of emotional and physical like exhaustion. And I felt like I was going crazy. I really did. I felt like I was literally losing my mind. I think that's what made me start reaching out to some of these other resources, because I was just like, I'm going nuts. Grief makes you feel like you are going crazy. And then I think spiritually for me, yes, I knew my brother is with the Lord. I have no doubt that Brian is resting in the arms of Jesus. Like, I have no doubt that my dad has gone from labor to reward. That is not even an inkling in my mind that God is not real and he is not taking care of his children right now. But spiritually, I became very afraid. And I was reading something that said that there are like 365 verses that say, fear not, one for every day of the year. You couldn't pay me to fear not. I was so afraid. And I think still some of that is with me now. Afraid of what if something happens to us? What if something happens to Dishon? What if something happens to me? What if something happens to Joey? What if, you know, all of that. Like, I think that affected me spiritually because I felt like, well, God, you took Brian, you took Daddy. So how am I supposed to not be afraid when you taking folks left and right? So that's something I wrestled through spiritually.
I'm sure it didn't help that we were in the midst of a
Panorama.
No, I wasn't even gonna say a pandemic. That we were spiritually, things just weren't settled because we had lost Pastor Walker the year we lost Brian.
Oh my gosh. So our pastor died in February. And I remember Brian being there at the funeral. I remember me and Brian talking about what a great man he was. And then mere months later, my brother died. And if you've ever been in a church where the pastor dies, that's a transition period. And I felt like there was spiritual death.
We were just in a fog as a congregation.
Yes. And I don't feel like there was anyone that had been in leadership there that was able to lift us out of the fog.
Yeah.
I feel like we were left to our own devices.
Yeah, groping in the dark.
Absolutely. And so you're not being spiritually fed. And it was in that season that I was like, I got to get some spiritual help. Like, honestly, that was when you became my pastor.
God bless you.
I'm serious. Remember we started doing small group remember, because the pandemic then happened, but you with our small group and seeing you prepare messages and just the Bible studies that you were doing to help support the leaders while they were doing their thing. I was like, and I would tell you, I'm like, thank you. Like, thank God you preached. Like, that message gave me what I needed. Like, I need some messages. I'm struggling. I'm crying through praise and worship. The heck? Like, I'm not making it through.
Yeah.
And I'm at this church and I feel like we going through because our pastor just died. Like, I'm struggling. Thank God for Tony Evans. Thank God for the internet.
Yeah.
Eric Mason. You know, just those sermons where I can listen to and be like, okay, Jesus, you have a ram in the bush on Spotify.
That is hilarious. Wow. Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah. So, dry place.
Yeah. And then, though, after that, then there was the pandemic. Which was, honestly, if it wasn't for the pandemic, I don't know when I would have started cooking again. I started cooking again because of the pandemic because I was scared. I was like, I'm not finna go eat out. That COVID gonna be on my food. So I started going to, I went to the grocery store but then I still wasn't eating healthy. Like me and Joey were making brownies and banana breads and cookies. We were making so many cookies and I was cooking just macaroni and cheese and chicken, stuff that I don't even be cooking but twice a year. It was good though.
It all sound good right now.
I know, I'm hungry.
Hey folks, so we're gonna stop right here on part 1 of this grief episode. If you want to talk with us about ways grief has impacted you, feel free to put it in the comments below and just share with us your experience with grief. Let us know what you're dealing with and join us on episode 2, part 2 of our grief discussion. Thanks.